The voice pierced the air as if it had pierced my own head. It didn't say my name. It didn't ask for help. It didn't explain anything. It just hurled a word at me. Run. And for a moment I truly believed someone was there with me in that stuffy bunker, where the air always seemed too stale to breathe effortlessly. My body responded before my consciousness. My muscles tensed as if they still knew how to obey orders I no longer remembered receiving. And I stood there, trying to understand if it had been a memory, fear, or just another one of those echoes that war leaves inside us. Have you ever felt a word push your chest back without touching you? I felt it. I felt as if that voice had been born in the same place where I learned to survive, not where I learned to live. The silence that followed was worse, because silence is never just silence when you carry a past that doesn't know how to rest. The bunker remained the same. Cold concrete, metallic smell, dampness clinging to the walls as if time had stopped there by choice, and I, standing in the middle of it, trying to remember when I stopped feeling my own weight on the ground. I stepped, but it felt like I wasn't there. I breathed, but I didn't recognize the air coming in. Run. The word still echoed inside me like a silent siren, an order without a commander, a flight without direction. And I wondered, what exactly should I be running from now? From the place, or from myself? The war was over, at least on the calendar, at least for those who never had to sleep with the feeling that the ground could disappear beneath their feet. For me, it still breathed in details too small to explain, in the way I counted steps, in how I avoided touching the walls, in the automatic reflex of searching for exits in any room. Do you also keep things that nobody sees? Things that don't leave marks on your skin but change the way you enter a place or the way you leave? I closed my eyes for a few seconds, not to rest, but to confirm that I was still awake. The problem is that the difference between being awake and remembering isn't always clear when you live with invisible scars. Sometimes the mind just changes the scenery, but keeps the pain. I was no longer on the battlefield, but I wasn't home either. I was in that strange space between surviving and existing, between returning and never having truly left. Run. The word returned, lower now, almost like a tired whisper, and I wondered if that voice wanted to save me, or just remind me that I still knew how to feel fear. My chest tightened, not from panic, but from recognition, because there are pains that we don't confront, we just carry. Have you ever tried to explain to someone that you've returned, but not whole, that your body arrived before your soul, that your nights still hear what your days pretend to forget? I stood there, motionless, with the strange feeling that running was no longer about escaping danger, but about fleeing from something I didn't yet know how to name, and perhaps it wasn't even ready to remember, and perhaps he wasn't even ready to remember. I remained like that for longer than I can measure, because when the mind enters that place, the clock loses the courage to tick. The concrete remained cold, but now it was inside me that something seemed to harden. It wasn't anger. It wasn't sadness. It was a kind of shapeless weight, as if all the things I hadn't said had decided to stay. Run. The word didn't come back, but its absence was almost worse, because the silence after an order is when you realize that nobody is in charge anymore. I touched the wall just to make sure it existed, and it did exist. Firm, real, different from me. My finger felt the rough texture, and for a second that anchored me in the present. Just for a second. Are you also looking for small signs that you're still here? A touch, a sound, any detail that prevents the mind from slipping back to places that don't ask permission. I took a deeper breath, not out of courage, but out of exhaustion, because running from your own head is a kind of race that never ends, and nobody applauds when you arrive. I thought about the people who said I had come back different, and I nodded, but never with words. Different is too comfortable a word for what really happens. Some parts of us don't change. They just stay silent. I looked at the floor and realized I still avoided looking up indoors. Habit, they say. But habits are also memories they've learned to disguise. Perhaps you're listening to this now and thinking you understand more than you'd like. Maybe not. Maybe you're just curious. Maybe you're tired. Any of those reasons is enough to stay. If any part of this story touched on something you also can't explain, leave a sign. It doesn't even have to be the right word. Sometimes a small gesture is enough to show that someone is listening. And if you want to continue walking with me through these twisted memories, stay close. Not because I have answers, but because sometimes it's easier not to go through it alone. I closed my eyes again, not to escape, but to try to recognize who I was before I learned to survive rather than live. And in that brief darkness, and I almost felt like crying, not from pain, but from exhaustion. Run. The word didn't appear, but the feeling that it still existed remained there, lingering, like a memory that hasn't yet decided whether it will become reality or just another shadow. And I remained still, not out of fear, but because some stories only begin when we accept not running, even without knowing exactly where we're headed, even without knowing exactly where he was going. The echo of the word still bounced off the walls when I realized I was alone, completely, and that the voice was coming from within. There were no boots behind me, no other breath, no other body sharing that space. Just me, and the memory trying to disguise itself as sound. I stood still because moving seemed like too big a decision for that moment, and I had already made too many decisions in places where I wasn't asked if I was ready. Some choices don't end when the action is over. They continue to live inside us like a hidden truth that no one taught us how to translate. The bunker seemed smaller now, not because the walls had gotten closer, but because I had grown bigger inside. Not bigger in courage, bigger in impact. Every souvenir took up space. Every silence had weight. Every breath seemed to carry something I didn't yet know where to put. Have you ever noticed how certain memories don't return as images, but as sensations? A tightness, a chill, an emptiness that doesn't ask permission. That's how they enter, as if the body recognizes them before the mind. The voice had no owner, but it had an origin. It came from the place where I hid everything that didn't fit into the versions I told others. It came from the place where people don't go, not even when they ask how you are. I thought about all the times I answered, "I'm fine," without realizing I was just being functional. Functioning isn't living. Functioning is surviving in silence. The walls continued to echo a sound that no longer existed, and that reminded me that even emptiness has a memory. Silence is never neutral. It carries what was said, what wasn't, and what never found the courage to exist. I touched my chest, not because of physical pain, but to confirm that there was still a rhythm there. My heart was still doing its job, even when I was no longer sure of mine. Identity isn't something that's lost all at once. It wears away in small absences. Have you ever felt like you no longer recognized the way you breathed? That your body still functioned, but you no longer felt in control of it? I sat on the floor because my legs weren't tired. I was. The impact of loneliness wasn't loud. It was slow. It was like realizing that no one would come to confirm what I was feeling, and that maybe it had always been this way. The voice had come from within, and that hurt more than if it had come from outside, because we learn to confront external enemies. But when the conflict is born in one's own memory, the struggle has no audience, no witnesses, no clear backstage. I started remembering little things, not the explosions, not the screams, but the details that nobody mentions when talking about war. The smell of cold coffee in a plastic cup, the dust accumulated in the corners of boots, the sound of the wind passing through places that shouldn't be empty. These are the things that remain. The rest we try to organize as history, but history never tells everything. Transformation is not an event. It's a silent process that begins when you realize you're no longer the person you were when you entered, but you also don't yet know who you left. I realized that voice didn't want me to run from the bunker. It wanted me to run from what I didn't yet have the courage to look at. The word run wasn't about physical escape. It was a plea for emotional distance. But distance also hurts, sometimes more than closeness. Have you ever tried to run away from something that was inside you? It doesn't work. You just change the scenery. The conflict travels with you. I breathed more slowly, not to calm myself down, but to listen better. Because when the voice comes from within, it doesn't always shout. Sometimes it just insists. Silence returned to fill the space, but now it didn't seem empty. It seemed full of decisions I hadn't yet made. Some choices we avoid, not because we don't know what to do, but because we know how we'll feel afterward. I thought about who I was before I donned any uniform, before I learned to measure value in resilience. That version seemed distant, but not dead. It still existed in fragments, in gestures I didn't perceive, in thoughts that escaped without asking permission. Identity doesn't disappear. It hides when it believes it's no longer welcome. I leaned my head against the cold wall and closed my eyes, not to sleep, but to remember without images. Sometimes remembering without seeing hurts less. Sometimes it hurts more. There's no rule. The bunker no longer looked like a shelter. It looked like a mirror, a place where I could no longer pretend I was alone, a place where the hidden truth finally had room to breathe. I didn't cry, not because I didn't want to, but because some pains still don't know how to come out in the form of tears. They come out silently, in pause, with weight. Have you ever been in a place where nobody saw you, but you saw yourself too much? I stood there, listening to my own breathing as if it were someone else's, observing my thoughts as if they belonged to someone I needed to understand before responding. Perhaps that was the true return from the war, not the moment I came home, but the moment I realized I had gone back inside. And going back inland is harder than crossing any border. The voice had come from within, and that meant the next decision would have to come as well. Not now, not at that moment, but at some point when I would have the courage to admit that I was still in process. Transformation doesn't happen when the pain ends. It begins when we accept that the pain exists. I remained silent, not for lack of words, but because some truths can only emerge when they are not rushed. The memory remained there, not as an enemy, but as a witness, and I began to understand that I didn't need to fight against it. Perhaps I just needed to listen to it without running away. The word run didn't return, but it left room for another feeling, a fragile feeling, almost timid, that staying can also be a form of courage. And I remained there, sitting on the cold floor, feeling the impact of still being alive, even without knowing exactly what that meant at that moment. If any part of that silence spoke to you, leave your mark in the comments. Sometimes we just need to know we weren't the only ones who heard it, and all I could remember was the smell of rust and dust. My body reacted before my mind. My legs wanted to run. My heart wanted to hide, and I stayed there, suspended between two impulses that didn't know how to communicate. It wasn't pure fear. It was memory dressed as reflection. It was the impact of everything that had already happened trying to decide for me again. The smell came from nowhere, and yet it was there. Rust, dust, old metal, as if the air had learned to keep secrets. The sense of smell is cruel like that. It finds the hidden truth before reason. I realized I was still reacting as if I were in the background of something that never ended. Every muscle carried decisions I didn't remember consciously making. The body learns before consciousness. The body doesn't ask for permission. Have you noticed how he anticipates things? As if he's saying, I know, before you even admit it. My legs were ready to run, but there was no direction. Run where when danger has no form, when it only has sensation? My heart wanted to hide. Not from something external, but from the very memory of having felt too much. I placed my hand on my chest, not to calm down, but to confirm that there was still something there that hadn't completely given up. The rhythm was accelerated, not from panic, but from recognition. The body recognizes before it understands. The imaginary dust seemed to stick to my throat, and I swallowed hard, as if I were cleaning a place that couldn't be cleaned. Some memories don't fade. They just change texture. The smell of rust took me far away, and at the same time brought me back. Places overlap when memory decides to play map. The past respects no distance. I thought about how many times I've returned home and yet remained somewhere else. How many conversations I've had responding with automatic words while inside I was just trying to organize the ruins. Identity is also this. What's left when you stop pretending to be whole? My body wanted to run, because running always seemed like a simple solution. But my mind was still behind, trying to understand exactly what I was running from now. It wasn't the bunker. It wasn't the memory. It wasn't the silence. It was the feeling that I no longer knew which version of myself to trust. The impact didn't come in waves. It came in details, in the way I clenched my fingers, in the involuntary tension of my shoulders, in the way my eyes searched for something they couldn't name. Have you ever felt like this? Torn between acting and hiding, between moving forward and disappearing? The smell lingered, even though it wasn't there anymore. It reminded me that some truths don't need physical presence to hurt. Memory creates scenarios with a precision that no real place can rival. I breathed faster, then slower, trying to teach my body that there was no immediate danger. But the body doesn't listen to arguments. It only respects experiences. The imaginary dust seemed to move in the air, as if the memory itself had particles. I could almost see them dancing in the dim light that filtered through an invisible crack, behind the scenes of a scene that only I witnessed. My heart wanted to hide, not because it was weak, but because it was tired of being the first to react. Tiredness is also a form of impact. I thought about the decisions I made without realizing I was making them, about the times I chose not to feel in order to keep going. Some choices don't seem like choices when they're made. Transformation doesn't come with a warning. It happens while you believe you're still the same. I closed my eyes for a second, and the smell grew stronger. Rust, dust, accumulated time. The past also ages, but it never dies. When I opened my eyes, I realized that my legs were still ready to run, not because I wanted to leave, but because my body hadn't yet learned to stay. Staying is harder than running away. The silence around me seemed to observe my indecision. There was no judgment, only presence. And presence sometimes weighs more than any noise. I thought about all the people who would never know about this moment, about how most battles happen out of sight, behind the scenes of one's own mind. That's where the hidden truth is built. My heart pounded for a few seconds, then slowed down, as if trying to reconcile itself with the rest of me. I let it lead for a moment. Sometimes it's safer to trust the rhythm than logic. Have you ever tried listening to your own body without trying to correct it? Without saying calm down, without saying pass, just listening. The smell began to fade, not because it went away, but because I stopped fighting it. Resisting also intensifies. The imaginary dust settled somewhere in my memory, and I realized that that memory didn't want to hurt me. It wanted to be acknowledged. My legs still wanted to run, but now they ran inward. My heart still wanted to hide, but now it hid within me. I remained seated, feeling the slow impact of being conscious in that body that had already been through more than I could explain. A body that held stories without words. Identity isn't lost when we suffer. It just fragments in order to survive. I thought about who I was on ordinary days. In supermarkets, in cafes, in small conversations. That version seemed simple, but it silently carried all of that. Have you ever noticed how many invisible secrets people have behind the scenes? The smell wasn't as strong anymore, but it was still there, like a mark of passage. Some memories don't want to be the main focus. They just want to exist. I let my legs relax a little, just a little. I let my heart find a less urgent rhythm. It wasn't peace. It was a truce. And I stayed there, in that strange interval between running and staying, between remembering and moving on, feeling that maybe my body was starting to trust that it didn't need to decide everything right now. If this part has also found a space within you, write in the comments what your body is still silently trying to tell you. And I stayed there, in that strange interval between running and staying, between remembering and moving on, feeling that maybe my body was starting to trust that it didn't need to decide everything right now. I had survived the war, but I hadn't returned from it. That phrase came without ceremony, as if someone had written it from within, and I was only reading it too late. To survive was a verb I knew how to conjugate perfectly, without hesitation. To return was different. To return demanded presence. To return demanded identity. To return demanded that I admit there was a place called after, and that I hadn't yet arrived there. It's strange to think about this in the United States, where the streets continue to function as if nothing had happened. Traffic lights and lines and coffee in giant cups. People complaining about the traffic as if the whole world could fit into that delay. I walked through these things as if I were crossing a staged scene. Everything seemed too normal for someone who still heard behind-the-scenes gossip. Have you ever felt like this? Like you were in a place that didn't suit you? Like the world was on one frequency and you were on another? When I returned, people greeted me with a kind of pride that couldn't be contained. They said thank you for your service with such pure good intentions it hurt. I nodded. I smiled. I repeated the right phrases. Because there's a social script for that. There's an American way of acknowledging pain without looking too closely at it. And I didn't want them to look either. Not really. The impact of returning wasn't a huge shock. It was a series of small mishaps. The first time I woke up with my heart racing and realized it was just my room. The first time I walked into a supermarket and the cleaning products aisle left me breathless because of a specific smell. The first time someone asked a simple question and I took too long to answer because my mind wandered for a few seconds, I thought that returning would be like going through an airport, picking up my bags, walking through the automatic door, and that's it. But returning isn't geographical. It's internal, and internal doesn't have a sign. Sometimes I felt I was still there. Not there at some point on a map, but there in a state. A place where everything was a quick decision. Where trust was a luxury. Where silence wasn't rest. It was alert. Out here people talk a lot. Opinions, news, sports, politics, the weather, everything at a constant volume. And I've learned to respond with short sentences because talking too much seemed to create space for the hidden truth to escape. I didn't want anyone to see the mess. The mess wasn't pretty. It wasn't heroic. It was human, imperfect. And I had the impression that the world only wanted to hear a clean version. A version that would fit on a bumper sticker or in a Memorial Day post. Have you ever noticed how recognition sometimes comes with expectations? As if praising you also meant asking you not to complicate things. I tried to be the kind of person people expected me to be. Strong, grateful, resilient. But inside I just felt like I'd become a collection of reactions. As if my identity had been hastily assembled to keep me functioning. Transformation. I heard that word as if it were something positive, as if it were evolution. But I didn't feel evolved. I felt altered, reconfigured, like a device that comes back from repair with new parts and nobody tells you what was replaced. I would walk into a room and automatically look for the exit. I would sit in places where I could see the door. I avoided having my back to the wall. I laughed the right way at the right moments. I feigned surprise when someone told me something silly. I seemed normal. And that's what's scary. Because I believed it sometimes too. There are days when the memory is quiet, and that almost gives hope. Then comes a random sound, a distant exhaust pop, a pan falling to the floor, and that's it. The body reacts before the mind. The impact happens again, not like a movie, like a reflex. I hated the reflection, not because of the fright, because of what it said. It said that I hadn't returned yet, that I was still living with one foot in the past. That I was still governed by old decisions. Decisions. That word carries weight, because I remember choices that didn't seem like choices. War puts you in a narrow corridor where every option has a price, and you learn to accept the price as if it were normal. So here they ask you to choose small things in which cereal to buy, which series to watch, where to park, and I braked as if even the mundane had hidden risks. Have you ever stood there looking at something simple and felt ashamed that you couldn't be simple yourself? There were times when I wanted to shout that I had survived, but that this wasn't a happy ending. Surviving is the beginning of another kind of battle. A battle without uniforms, without clear orders, without comrades by my side. A battle in silence. And the silence in the United States is strange because it's a silence full of sound. The air conditioning, the refrigerator, the TV on somewhere, the cell phone vibrating. There's always something filling the space, and yet, when I lay down, it was as if everything shut down inside, and I was left alone with background noise that no one could see. I thought about the people who had stayed behind. I thought about names. I thought about moments. But I didn't want to turn it into a list, because a list becomes a tribute, and a tribute becomes distance. I didn't want distance. I wanted to understand why I was here, and at the same time I wasn't. The hidden truth wasn't just that I was afraid. It was that I no longer knew who I was without that context. I didn't know who I was without the adrenaline, without the mission, without the brutal clarity of a goal. Here, everything is full of possibilities, and that should be a good thing. But too many possibilities seem like an abyss when you come back broken inside. I wanted to be someone again. Someone who wasn't just reaction, just defense, just performance. But here's the problem. I didn't know where to begin without seeming weak. There's a whole culture that celebrates the tough guy, the one who endures, the one who doesn't complain, the one who follows through. I had been trained for that, and I did it well. But doing good was costing me dearly. I started to realize that going back isn't a single event. It's a series of small confrontations with daily life. It's accepting that you'll feel out of place at the first party, at the first family dinner, the first time someone asks how it was there. Because the question seems simple to someone who's never been. For someone who has been, it opens up a long corridor. And I didn't want to go into that hallway, because I didn't know if I'd have the courage to leave. I was breathing and trying to convince myself that I was safe. But safety isn't just the absence of danger. It's the presence of meaning. And I was still searching for meaning like someone looking for a lost object in a dark room. I had survived the war, but I hadn't returned from it. And admitting that didn't make me weak. It made me honest. At least with myself. At least in that bunker. At least in that instant when the voice had come from within and I finally stopped pretending it was just exhaustion. The silence remained there, not as emptiness, but as space. And space is dangerous, because space allows memory to move. It allows identity to appear without a mask. It allows transformation to begin to hurt in a different way. I wasn't ready to call it healing. I didn't even know if I believed in that word. I just knew that something inside me had gotten tired of running. And when you stop running, wait, you hear things. And I was listening. If you've ever lived on the outside while inside you were still there, tell me in the comments what that silence is like. And I was listening. The scars weren't on the uniform, nor on the skin. They were in the way I breathed when everything was silent. That's where they appeared, not as explicit pain, but as a discord, a delay between inhaling and trusting, a short interval where the body still questioned whether it could exist in peace. I realized this on an ordinary afternoon, one of those that the United States knows how to make seem too normal. Clear skies, flags on the lampposts, cars driving by with loud music, people arguing about gas prices as if that were the biggest problem of the day. I was sitting on some random bench, and suddenly I realized I was breathing, as if there was still something to avoid. Have you ever noticed your own breath? Have you ever realized when it carries more history than air? When the noise subsided? When someone turned off the television? When the street became empty? My chest tightened a little. It wasn't panic. It was memory. A memory without images, but with impact. I was breathing shallowly. I was breathing attentively. I was breathing like someone still in the wings of something that could happen at any moment. The silence was never just silence. It came full of expectation, full of unasked questions, full of decisions I didn't remember making. I tried to ignore it for a long time, because admitting that even my breathing had changed seemed like an exaggeration, but it wasn't. Breathing is the first thing you learn to protect yourself from. The body doesn't wait for the mind to give permission. People looked at me and saw a whole person. I looked at myself and saw a system in operation, not a presence, a functioning system. Identity is not just who you are. It's how you occupy your own body. I began to realize that my silence also had a texture. It wasn't calm. It was dense. It came laden with memory. And memory doesn't disappear when we change scenery. It just changes its clothes. Sometimes I was at a dinner party, someone telling a funny story, laughter, silverware clinking on plates, and I was there, breathing too carefully for such a lighthearted moment. I participated. I smiled. I agreed. But inside I was attentive to the silence that would follow, because that's when the scars breathe. Have you ever been afraid of a moment that hasn't even arrived yet, just because you know how it usually behaves? I avoided being alone in silence. I played music softly. I left the TV on without watching. I accepted invitations I didn't want, because the silence demanded more from me than I knew how to give. When he came with questions, with memories, with a hidden truth that had no organized words. The scars weren't on the uniform, because I wasn't wearing it anymore. They weren't on my skin, because nobody pointed them out. They were in the way I breathed when nobody was looking. And that scared me more than any visible wound. I started paying attention to the details, to the rhythm, to the sound of the air going in, to the weight of the air going out, to how my chest always seemed ready to contract, to how my shoulders rarely rested completely. My body didn't trust the silence, and perhaps the silence didn't trust me. In the United States, silence is treated as comfort, as rest, as peace. But for me, it was still too open a field, a space where memory could run wild. I remembered things unintentionally, a look, a gesture, a distant sound. Everything had the potential to become a trigger, but I hated that word. Trigger sounds too technical for something so human. I would prefer to call it an unannounced memory. The impact was gentle. It didn't knock me down, but it displaced me. It took me out of the present moment for a few seconds. It made me breathe as if I were still somewhere else. And then I would come back. I always came back. But I would come back different for a few moments. Transformation isn't about becoming a different person. It's about learning to live with who you've become without realizing it. I began to accept that my scars didn't want to disappear. They wanted to be understood. They didn't want public attention. They wanted inner space. But inner space is something we learn to deny when we grow up hearing that we need to be strong. Strong means not bothering anyone. Strong means not speaking. Strong means not stopping. And I had been very strong for a long time. I was breathing, and each breath felt like a silent negotiation between the past and the present, between who I had been and who I didn't yet know how to be. Sometimes I felt angry about it, angry that I couldn't just move on, angry that I was still carrying the burden of going backstage when the world only saw the stage. Other times I felt sorry for myself, but I quickly hid that too, because even compassion seemed dangerous. Have you ever been afraid to feel for yourself? I began to understand that my breath was my most honest language. It said what I didn't say. It revealed what I hid. It delivered the hidden truth without needing words. When I breathed shallowly, I knew something had triggered a memory. When I breathed deeply, I knew I was trying to convince myself that I was safe. When I breathed normally, it was almost a miracle. I didn't tell anyone. Not because I didn't trust them, but because I didn't know how to explain it. Some things don't need explaining, they need recognition. I started observing the people around me, in lines, in cafes, in parking lots, and I realized that many of them breathed like me, in different ways, for different reasons, but with the same hidden tension. Perhaps everyone carries invisible scars. Some have simply learned to disguise them better. My identity no longer fit into the words veteran, survivor, strong. Those words were too small for the real mess. I was someone trying to learn to breathe silently without feeling the need to run away from it. I still failed, many times, but there were moments when the air entered without resistance, when my chest didn't tighten, when my body didn't prepare for anything, when I simply existed. These moments were brief, but they existed, and that was something. The silence remained difficult, but it was also beginning to feel a little less threatening. Not because I had won something, but because I had stopped fighting against everything. The memory was still there. The identity was still being reconstructed. The decisions still seemed too big, but I was breathing, in my own way, imperfect, human, and perhaps that too was a form of transformation. If your silence also changes the way you breathe, tell me in the comments how it sounds inside you. And that was something. People said I was strong, and I smiled because it was easier than explaining the emptiness. The smile was quick, automatic, trained. It didn't exactly lie. It just deflected. It was a polite gesture to protect a hidden truth that had no social packaging. Being strong sounds nice here in the United States. Strong goes with speeches, with flags, with stories of overcoming adversity that fit into a 2-minute news report. Strong is a word people use when they don't know what else to say. And I accepted it. I always accepted it. Have you ever accepted a compliment that didn't match how you felt inside? I smiled to avoid creating silence. Because silence calls for questions. Questions demand answers. And I didn't have answers that could be contained in short sentences. Emptiness is not a hole. It is a space filled with things that don't know how to get out. It is a mess that is too organized to be called chaos, and too sensitive to be ignored. When someone said you are strong, I felt a small impact, almost imperceptible, but constant, like a light tap on the same spot. It didn't hurt immediately, but it left a mark. I wondered silently if they were praising who I was, or who they needed me to be. I didn't want to disappoint anyone. I didn't want to seem fragile. I didn't want to become a problem. So I smiled, and smiling became a decision I made without realizing it. Small decisions also shape identities. The emptiness didn't show on my face. It appeared when I got home and silently took off my shoes, when I stared at the television without really watching, when I opened the refrigerator without being hungry, when I closed it without taking anything. He would appear when the world stopped watching me. People saw me as someone who had returned whole. I saw myself as someone who had learned to function in parts. Backstage full, stage set up. I thought about how many times I had heard stories from other veterans and noticed the same smile, the same way of agreeing, the same look away when someone got too close to the center of the pain. We quickly learned that some truths are not welcome in lighthearted conversations. So we adapt. Transformation is also about this. Learning to fit in, but fitting in too tightly hurts. I started noticing that my smile didn't match my gaze. My eyes were always a little behind, as if they were still looking at something that had already passed. Memory does not respect the education of the face. Sometimes I'd be at a family gathering, laughter, old stories, someone talking about plans, and I'd smile, but inside I felt a strange distance, not of affection, but of belonging, as if I were there, and at the same time on another plane. Have you ever felt both present and absent in the same place? The emptiness didn't scream. It didn't demand attention. It simply remained. And that was the hardest part, because there was nothing to fight. There was no enemy. There was no confrontation. There was only an absence occupying space. I began to realize that the strength people saw in me wasn't the strength I felt. For them, strength was not crying. For me, strength was getting out of bed on days when my identity seemed blurred. But I didn't say that. I smiled. I smiled when someone said I had moved on. I smiled when someone said it was all in the past. I smiled when someone said that now it was just a matter of moving forward. I smiled because explaining the emptiness would require breaking the comfortable rhythm of the conversation, and I didn't want to be the cause of collective discomfort. It's strange how we learn to protect the environment even when it's broken inside. The impact of this habit wasn't immediate. It came later, when I realized that I myself was starting to believe in my own smile. I started to doubt my pain. I started to think that maybe I was exaggerating. Have you ever questioned your own sadness because no one else seemed to see it? The emptiness didn't want to be dramatic. It just wanted to be acknowledged. But I still didn't know how to do that without feeling like I was asking too much. I grew up in a culture that teaches you to solve problems, to fix things, to act. But nobody teaches you how to feel when there isn't a clear solution. So I would solve it with a smile. I resolved it by agreeing. I solved it by changing the subject. I solved it by pretending that everything was in its place. But inside, things were just arranged so they wouldn't fall. Identity is also this. The way you learn to present yourself so as not to reveal what you don't yet understand. I didn't want people to think I was stuck in the past. I didn't want them to think I was using the war as an excuse. I didn't want to be seen as someone who was broken. So I accepted being seen as strong, even when I felt empty. The emptiness wasn't pure sadness. It was a lack of meaning at times. It was looking at good things and not feeling the impact I expected to feel. It was listening to music and not recognizing the emotion. It was laughing and realizing that the laughter had no root. I wondered if this was also a form of mourning. Mourning for the version of myself that I didn't know if it still existed. I tried to remember who I was before, but the memories came jumbled together, like blurry photographs, like memories that still existed but no longer knew where to fit in. And even so, I smiled, because the smile kept everything in order. It was the social glue that held the cracks together. I didn't blame people. They had no way of knowing. And I didn't give clear signs either. The hidden truth doesn't reveal itself. Sometimes I thought about saying something, about responding differently, about not smiling, about admitting that I didn't feel strong, that I felt tired, confused, rebuilding myself. But then I remembered the uncomfortable looks I'd seen when someone broke the script, and I chose to smile again. Survival decisions continue to exist even after war. The emptiness didn't go away, but it began to change shape when I started to realize it wasn't my enemy. It was just a space that hadn't yet been named. Maybe one day I'll be able to talk about him without needing to smile. Maybe one day I'll be able to let him exist out loud. For now, I still smile sometimes, but now I realize when I'm doing it for others and when I'm doing it for myself. And this perception, even a small one, is already a kind of transformation. If you've ever smiled to hide what words couldn't express, tell me in the comments what that emptiness feels like for you. And that perception, even a small one, was already a kind of transformation. Sometimes I would hear footsteps that weren't there, voices that weren't there, and cries for help that only I could hear. They weren't loud. They weren't clear. They came like a distant noise trying to pass through a glass wall. I would stop. I would hold my breath. I would wait, and nothing would happen. But inside, something had happened. The footsteps had no weight. They had intention. They sounded like movement without a body, like presence without proof. I looked at the empty hallways of the buildings. at the parking lots at night, at the corners of the house when the light had already been turned off, and felt the silent impact of realizing that memory, too, knows how to walk. Have you ever heard something that wasn't really there, but still changed you? The voices came in fragments. They weren't complete sentences. They were pieces, tones, formless calls. I didn't recognize faces. I didn't recognize names. I recognized emotion, and that was the hardest thing to turn off. The cries for help were the worst, not because they were loud, but because they were familiar. They had the same rhythm as things I'd heard before, the same urgency, the same contained desperation, the same sense of urgency not knowing if it would be answered. And I would stand there, trying to remember if that was memory, imagination, or just a part of my identity that hadn't yet found rest. In the United States, houses are quiet at night. Not absolute silence, but an organized silence. Refrigerators, clocks, the distant sound of a passing car. It is in this kind of silence that voices find space. I've tried pretending I didn't hear. I've tried turning on music, I've tried getting up, I've tried ignoring it. But ignoring is also a decision, and decisions leave traces. The voices weren't there to scare me. They were there to remind me. And I didn't know if remembering was a punishment or an attempt at self-preservation. Sometimes I would hear footsteps and my body would react before my mind. Shoulders tense, jaw clenched, breathing short. I became someone backstage again, even without a stage, even without an audience. The impact wasn't in the sound, it was in the reaction. And the reaction told me that I hadn't returned yet, that I was still somewhere between what was and what is. Have you ever noticed how the body doesn't accept arguments? It only accepts experiences. The voices never said my name. That always intrigued me. They didn't call me. They simply existed, as if they didn't need an address to be heard. The cries for help didn't come with faces either. They were echoes of humanity, echoes of situations, echoes of decisions that weren't finalized. I wondered if it was guilt, if it was responsibility, if it was just a memory stubbornly refusing to be erased. The hidden truth is that I didn't want them to leave. Not completely, because in some strange way, they reminded me that I still felt, that I still cared, that I hadn't yet become a completely empty person. But at the same time, I wanted to rest. Identity is also this, the negotiation between what you want to forget and what you don't want to lose. I started to notice that the voices came more often when I was tired, when I was silent, when I had spent the whole day being overly functional. They appeared as if to say, now it's my turn. And I didn't know whether I should listen or whether I should protect. Have you ever been afraid to listen to your own memory? Sometimes I would answer in my thoughts, not with words, with intention, as if to say, I know, I remember, I'm still here. And at that moment the sounds would diminish a little. They wouldn't disappear, but they would recede. The imaginary footsteps receded. The voices grew quieter. The cries for help became less urgent, unresolved, but less aggressive. I began to understand that perhaps I wasn't being haunted. Perhaps I was being visited by parts of myself that hadn't yet found their place. Memory doesn't want to be destroyed. Memory wants to be recognized. But recognition hurts. And I was still learning to endure this pain without running away from it. The nights continued to be difficult. I would lie down and listen to the silence take shape, not with noise, but with presence. And presence is harder to ignore than sound. I was thinking about how people talk about ghosts, about hauntings, about supernatural things. But what I felt wasn't that. It was too human to be supernatural. It was the echo of decisions, the echo of choices, the echo of situations that don't fit into an organized timeline. I wasn't being persecuted. I was being reminded. And remembering is a type of transformation that no one teaches you how to go through. Sometimes I would sit on the bed and stare at the wall. I wouldn't see anything, but I would feel everything, as if the past were playing on a different frequency, as if I were in two places at the same time. The footsteps weren't there, but the impact was. The voices weren't there, but the emotion was. The cries for help weren't coming from the environment, but from memory, and memory doesn't ask for permission. I began to realize that maybe I too had been a cry for help at some point. Maybe I too had been a voice for someone. Maybe I too had been a stepping stone for someone. That idea kept me quiet, not out of guilt, but out of conscience. The hidden truth is that no one goes through a war alone, even when it seems like they are. We carry pieces of others inside us, and they don't ask permission to stay. I breathed and tried to accept that these voices didn't want to hurt me. They wanted to exist. They wanted to be remembered without being turned into a spectacle. They wanted a quiet space to continue being human. I wasn't sure if I knew how to give that space, but I was trying to listen without sinking, trying to remember without disappearing, trying to exist without pretending I hear nothing. Transformation is not about silencing voices. It's about learning to coexist with them without letting them control everything. And I was still far from that. But I was beginning to understand that silence is not the absence of sound. It is the presence of memory. And I stayed there, listening to what didn't exist outside, but still existed inside. If you've ever heard something that no one else has, leave a comment about what remained after that silence. And I stayed there, listening to what didn't exist outside, but still existed inside. I was trying to live, but living seemed like a language I had forgotten how to speak. I recognized the words: work, bills, traffic, coffee, conversation, but I no longer recognized the intonation. I knew the vocabulary, but I had lost the rhythm, and a language without rhythm becomes effort. In the United States, life is fast-paced. Everything moves. Everything is decided. Everything demands an answer. And I was moving along, answering, deciding, but I felt like I was just imitating sounds, like someone who repeats phrases without fully understanding their meaning. Have you ever said something just to avoid breaking the silence? I would enter crowded places and feel like I was backstage. I was participating, but I didn't see myself. I was smiling, but I didn't recognize myself. Identity doesn't disappear all at once. It dissolves in small disconnections. I was trying to remember when living stopped being natural, when it became a set of tasks, a set of decisions that had no emotional impact, only functional. Life should hurt sometimes, but it should also be heartwarming. And I felt like I'd only gotten the hard part. Silence accompanied me like a poor translator. It told me I was present, but it didn't explain how to be whole. I walked through the streets looking at shop windows, people, reflections, and I had the feeling that everything was happening in another language, as if life were speaking to me in a code that I had once mastered, but had forgotten during the war. The memory was a hindrance, not because it hurt all the time, but because it changed the context. It transformed simple scenes into charged ones. A hug became tension. A touch became a warning. An invitation became a calculation. The impact of this wasn't immediate. It was cumulative. I tried to choose simple things: food, clothes, route, and felt that even that required translation, as if I had to relearn my own taste. Living seemed like a language without a dictionary, and perhaps that's why I felt tired even when I wasn't doing anything. Transformation doesn't only happen when we change, it happens when we realize we've already changed without noticing. I looked at myself and tried to find who I was in that present moment. Not the person from before, not the person from there, but the person from now. And this present moment still seemed without a caption. People said I was doing well. I agreed, because doing well is also a vague expression. It doesn't require details. It doesn't require hidden truths. But inside I felt I was just trying to pronounce a life that didn't sound natural coming from my mouth. Have you ever felt like a stranger within your own routine? I wanted to feel enthusiasm. I wanted to feel desire. I wanted to feel a sense of belonging. But everything came at low volumes, as if someone had turned down the sound of the experience. The silence wasn't emptiness. It was a poor translation. I breathed and tried to remember what it was like to live without thinking about how to live, without analyzing every sensation, without measuring every reaction. But memory wouldn't allow it. It interfered. It commented. It brought behind-the-scenes events to the stage. And I realized that maybe I hadn't forgotten how to live. Maybe I had just learned a new language, a language that hadn't yet been accepted anywhere. Identity is also this, learning to exist in a territory that doesn't yet recognize your accent. I kept trying, even when I made mistakes, even when I froze, even when I felt out of place, because somehow, even without fully understanding, I still wanted to live, not the old way, not the expected way, but the way that was possible. And that was already a decision, small, quiet, imperfect, but it was mine. If you're also trying to describe a life that still sounds strange, tell me in the comments what word you're still missing. And that was already a decision. That night in the bunker, I understood that it wasn't fear that kept me there. It was the guilt of having returned. The guilt didn't scream. It didn't press. It just stayed, like a presence too polite to be expelled, like a hidden truth that didn't want to be named so as not to seem like an accusation. I stared at the dark floor, trying to remember when I started to feel that existence had a price, not a financial price, an internal price, a silent cost that no one mentions when talking about returns. I knew fear. Fear has a form. It has symptoms. It has behavior. Guilt is different. It doesn't present itself as a threat. It presents itself as a question. Why am I here? Why did I come back? Why can I walk, breathe, choose, while others are stuck in a point in time? These questions didn't come in sequence. They came as fragments, behind-the-scenes glimpses of a dialogue that never ended. I realized that night wasn't about the bunker. It was about the mirror it had become, a space where I could no longer pretend that everything had been just about survival. There was also an internal negotiation, an attempt to justify my own continued existence. In the United States, returning is treated as a victory, but no one teaches you how to deal with the feeling that victory also carries losses that aren't yours, but now live within you. I didn't feel guilty for being alive. I felt guilty for not knowing what to do with this life. The memory came back with names I avoided pronouncing, with scenes I rearranged so as not to hurt so much, with decisions I still analyzed as if I could change them later. Have you ever tried rewriting something you've already finished? Guilt wasn't telling me I had done something wrong. It was telling me I hadn't yet found a way to be right. I looked at my hands that night and felt a strange impact. They were there, whole, capable, and that seemed like a privilege I hadn't yet learned to use without discomfort. The identity I carried was no longer just mine. It came mixed with other stories, other voices, other absences, and that weighed heavily on us. The silence of the bunker wasn't threatening. It was respectful. It seemed to give me space to feel what I had been avoiding. I understood that it wasn't fear that kept me there, because fear demands escape. Guilt demands permanence. It makes you stay to try to understand, to try to compensate, to try to deserve it. I didn't know how to deserve to be alive. Nobody teaches you that. I thought about all the times I had chosen to keep going, even without knowing how, even without knowing why. I had chosen by instinct, by habit, for survival, but now I wanted to choose based on conscience, and that was more difficult. The transformation wasn't about leaving guilt behind. It was about learning to walk with it without letting it define everything. I still didn't know how to do it. I only knew that guilt wasn't the enemy. It was a sign, a reminder that I still cared, and if I still cared, maybe there was still something to build. The bunker taught me that the past doesn't ask permission to coexist with the present. It simply occupies space until it is acknowledged. I breathed a little deeper that night, not to relieve, but to accept that I had no answers, to accept that my identity was still being assembled, to accept that memory still had a voice. I stayed there for a few more minutes, feeling the guilt not as condemnation, but as an open question. And open-ended questions are dangerous, because they don't let you rest on pre-prepared versions. They force you to continue, even without knowing how. If you've ever felt guilty for still being here, tell me in the comments how it sounds to you. And open-ended questions always call for a follow-up. And when I finally stood up, it wasn't to run. It was to admit that I needed to learn to exist again. My body rose slowly, as if every muscle was checking if that decision was real. There was no urgency. There was no heroism. There was only a choice too small to become a speech, too big to be ignored. I stood there feeling the weight on my feet, the impact of the ground confirming that I was still here, not in another time, not in another story. Here, even with the memory still whispering in the background, even with the silence still carrying questions. Learning to exist again didn't seem like a beautiful project. It seemed like a mistake in progress, a series of attempts that promised nothing more than movement. I thought about all the times I had merely functioned. Now I wanted to exist, and existing seemed to require more courage than anything else I had ever done. It wasn't about forgetting. It wasn't about forgiving everything. It wasn't about erasing the past. It was about recognizing that my identity no longer needed to fit into old versions of myself. I didn't know what this new way of existing would be like. I only knew it wouldn't be clean. It wouldn't be organized, it wouldn't be linear. And perhaps that was precisely what made it human. I took a step, just one. Not to leave the bunker, but to leave the version of myself that I believed still needed to remain hidden. The impact was internal. There was no sound. There was no visible change. But something inside me stirred, like someone accepting that they still don't know. But you want to try. The hidden truth hasn't disappeared. It has merely shifted. It has moved from the center of guilt to the edge of consciousness. Still present, but less dominant. The silence remained, but now it didn't paralyze me in the same way. It seemed more like a space for listening than a space for condemnation. I realized that learning to exist again didn't mean abandoning who I was. It meant allowing who I was to not dictate everything about who I could be. And that hurt a little, because some parts of us resist being set in motion. They prefer to remain as a fixed memory, but I didn't want to be just a memory anymore. I wanted to be present, even if imperfectly, even though I feel insecure, even without a complete translation. I took a deeper breath, not as if calming down, but as if allowing myself to. And in that simple gesture, I felt something different. Not peace, not relief, but possibility. Have you ever noticed how possibility isn't comfortable? It doesn't promise anything. It only invites. I still carried guilt. I still carried silence. I still carried behind-the-scenes drama. But now I also carried the decision not to be reduced to that. Learning to exist again was not a destination. It was a provisional state, a space between what was and what was yet to be named. And in that space, I finally stopped running inside. If this story touched a silent part within you, stay here with me. Sometimes hearing another's pain is the first step to recognizing your own. I remained standing no longer as someone who merely survives, but as someone who still doesn't know how to live properly, and yet chooses to try. Not because I understood everything, but because I accepted not understanding. The transformation didn't happen in that instant, but something opened up, something small, something fragile, something I wasn't yet sure if it would stay. And I stayed there, breathing within this new space, making no promises to myself, closing no doors, simply allowing identity to continue in motion. If this passage also touched on something you can't yet explain, leave a comment with a word that you're still learning to understand within yourself. If you felt this story resonated too deeply with some part of you, perhaps it's because it didn't end with me either. If you want to stay here, subscribe, not as a click, but as someone who chooses to keep listening. If any word resonated with you, write in the comments, not to explain, just to say I'm here too. And if this silence touched you in a way that can't be put into words, leave a like someone silently touching your shoulder. I'll still talk about this in the next video, not because I have answers, but because some stories only continue when someone stays, and I'm still here, thinking, breathing, trying to understand, and maybe hoping you are too.